Welcome, everyone, to this week's Cat's Eye on the Future. For those of you listening in the most recent archives, you will recognize that this show is coming right after Halloween of 2015. And even if you're not, you may still be interested in the topic, but it's going to be a little bit spooky. We have our regular guest back this time, Kvelduflr Gundarsson, who, in all fairness, is my husband. I will put truth in advertising here. But he's going to talk about a subject that I know he finds very interesting. And that is a topic of, it is involving dead people, but it's not exactly ghosts, what you might be expecting. This is a little more on this earth, shall we say. This is about bog bodies. And I'm going to turn you over to Kvelduflr and let him explain what a bog body is and what he'd like to talk about.
Okay. Now, for those of us who live in Northern Europe, bogs are a very familiar sight. People who grew up here, which I did not, and sometimes wandering tourists, which I have been, are strictly warned by their mommies or friends or travel agencies, whoever, not to go into the bog. Now, to imagine a Northern European bog, generally you start with a day like today. The light's already getting quite low this time of year. The sky is covered with gray clouds and dripping rain. In the more forested parts, the trees are still very, very bright. The gold of birch, brown horse chestnuts, red and gold of oaks, beautiful. But once you get out into the bog, every so often you see the white trunk of a single birch tree with a few tattered golden leaves left on it, and a landscape of gray and brown and flatness, and the occasional dark glimmer of water. And because it's a peat bog, you know that if you go into that water and look into it, you won't see anything, because the water is almost black with peat, which incidentally is why the ambiguity around Loch Ness has been able to continue, because even powerful modern underwater lights cannot actually pierce the peat-soaked water of the loch. But anyway, so here you are in this land of stones and grayish-brown moss and treacherous water, and the moss is not safe to walk on. In a bog, what looks like water may well have dry land just a foot or two beneath it, may still be safe, but often enough what looks like land has nothing but wet peat under it, going down, well, as far as you're concerned. If you're trapped and sinking in it, it might as well go down forever. Which is how long you're going to be down there if you're trapped.
So Lord Nimona comes along.
Yeah.
Lord
Nimona is the Irish electricity company, which does a lot of peat digging. So bogs are dangerous places, and they're borderland places. Because they are neither water nor earth, you really don't know what you're going to be stepping on the next time you take a step. You don't really know what's down there, but it's something kind of worrying. And bogs are also holy places for that reason, because they are border places. They're one of the places where we are closest to the other world, closest to the world of the gods, which is probably one of the reasons why they were such common spots for making human sacrifice. And if we go back in the neighborhood of 2,000 years-ish, we may recall Tacitus, who wrote about the worship of the goddess Nerthus. Nerthus is etymologically the same name as Njörður, who's the father of Freyr and Freya, but Tacitus describes her as a mother goddess, and there's some question as to whether a lot of her aspects were transferred to Freya, or possibly Freya, which is not a personal name, it's a title, it just means lady, might be another incarnation of Nerthus. We can't really answer those questions, though I may discuss the evidence for them further on. But because bogs are places of the other world, sacrifices were made, and in the cult of Nerthus, the statue of the goddess was carefully brought out at the beginning of summer, the end of winter, the season that people further south called spring, and she would be carried about in her wain and attended to bring fruitfulness to the land, and then they took her back to her island, to this a liminal place between land and water, and then they would drown the people that had been taking care of her, because she was just too sacred to be messed with otherwise. Now, interestingly, in a bog in Jutland was found a female figure carved out of oak. It's a very tall oak sapling that was just minimally carved at the fork to make sure that everyone really knew this was a female figure. And she was very carefully wrapped in linen and laid away under a cairn of stones in the bog. And it's been tempting to suggest, and a great many people have, that this was the image which would be used in a similar procession. She'd be left to rest in the bog during most of the year, and when the time came, she would be brought out, bringing all that gathered might of the underworld to spread out upon the land to make it fruitful again. Now, Tacitus's account of the sacrifice of Nerthus's caretakers is literary, but one of the things for which we have an extremely ample amount of archaeological indication is that sacrificing people in bogs was not uncommon, especially in that period from the late Celtic Iron Age through the Migration Age. Tended to fade away a bit by the time we got to the Viking Age, and it's pretty safe to say anything post-Viking found in a bog is probably like the Swedish Boxton man who was medieval, a victim of violence whose body was being concealed, or possibly, and this is just possible with Boxton man, because whoever put him there made a lot of effort to make sure he wasn't going to get up again, which is quite common with bog bodies. So it's possible that his killers, for whatever reason, felt that there was a real risk. Perhaps just the guilt of a guy who you've murdered and stuck his body in hiding might not unreasonably want to get up and come after you. Possibly this is more in the class of witch lynchings, where he was already a supernaturally suspect person before he was killed, and might or might not have been killed related to that. There's no way to tell. But we do know that whoever put him there was very concerned that he might return. And this is, as I mentioned, a very common feature, because really there seem to have been two main reasons for putting someone in a bog. The first of those was as an offering. The second of those was because you thought they might get up and come looking for you, or looking for chitlins, or whatever they might be looking for. We've done previous shows on the undead in Scandinavia. They have quite a range. Now, the effects of this are almost what you'd call paradoxical, because the thing that makes bog bodies so particularly fascinating is, remember I mentioned that black peat impregnated water just a little while ago? Well, peat contains a lot of tannin, and we call tanning leather for a reason, because tannin is one of the main things. Usually in leather, it was oak bark that was used, and still is. Some of the best tooling leather you can get is oak bark tanned. And the tannin in peat, in these peat bogs where the content is so extremely high, soaks into the body and it tans it. It preserves it so perfectly that if we take Tolland Man as an example, when he was put in the bog somewhere around the beginning of the Common Era, and when he was found First, he was in such good condition that first it was believed he was a recent murder victim. So the police came in and took his fingerprints, and they had no trouble taking his fingerprints. Curiously, they had a lot of trouble finding a match in the fingerprint bank.
They had no records going back 2,000 years.
Surprisingly not. Amazing how careless some people are about that sort of thing. And once it was eventually established that, in fact, he was a rather less recent deposition, when they examined the body further, they were able not only to get his stomach contents out, but to examine and identify them in absolute detail. In fact, they were able to break down the analysis in such detail that we knew what time of year he was put there, which was the end of winter, beginning of summer period, because everything in his stomach was something that would have been growing and available just at that time of year. It's all wild foods, all seems to have been gathered specially at that time in that season. And we know so exactly that it's actually possible to recreate the meal. In fact, the great P.V. Glubb, who wrote the book, The Bog People, and who was one of the great pillars of Danish archaeology for many years, actually on Danish national TV made up a complete reproduction of this glop and ate it right there in public with the gods and everyone watching. Now, apparently it was pretty nasty, and poor Professor Glubb had to kind of rinse his mouth off with some good Danish akavit afterwards. Something of which Dr. Glubb was not unfond, and in fact he wrote an excellent book that very few people know about on making tinctures and the like cordials for drinking to traditional Danish recipes. But P.V. Glubb aside, that gives you an idea of how perfectly preserved these bodies are.
I have a question on that. Do they think that the stuff tasted nasty because just we're not used to it, because of the time of year it was gathered, or did the plants themselves have magical properties that someone giving themselves as a sacrifice would want to eat?
The plants had magical properties. One of them was yarrow, and you know what yarrow tea tastes like.
Don't remind me.
Yeah. One of them was yarrow. Also included were black nightshade or woody nightshade leaves, which they're not as strong as, say, your Atropa belladonna, your deadly nightshade, but they would have had an anesthetic and possibly hallucinogenic effect. And that's also interesting because in the Viking Age we have occasional references to the cup of death. I believe Ibn Fodlan mentions it. And Odin also mentions the drinking horn with which he's not comforted before his hanging. And it seems, as best we can tell, at least into the Viking Age, that it was common to give people who were about to be offered up a cup of variously analgesic and possibly, indeed, probably hallucinogenic herbs to make the whole process easier, to tune them to the other world for starters. That bit we can't be really sure of. But what we can be reasonably sure of is that what Holland Man ate had the potential for at least mild psychoactive effects. Also, the fact that it was all gathered separately from the wild and contained a huge range of things suggests something possibly like what's going on in Akerboat, which involves taking, a wide range of seeds. Similarly, the Greenland Cearus, this was in Greenland where there wasn't a lot by way of plants, but it was important that she eat a meal including bits of the heart of every type of animal living on the estate for which she was prophesying, so that sort of gathering samples of everything for this single purpose is pretty typical.
Would he have been perhaps Given to the bog during the Hunger Gap, though. That was kind of what...
Yes, I hadn't thought about that, but you're right. That time of year would be when the Hunger Gap was starting. It would be, and again, it would be when people most needed that blessing of Nerthus in order to ensure that what was coming up would come up quickly, healthy, and that there would be food in more abundance later in the summer.
Yeah, not to get too far off topic, but just for my listeners who haven't listened before, the Hunger Gap is that time in the spring that if you're a traditional farmer, no matter what your climate is, unless you live somewhere not in the north where everything grows all year, you have this gap where it's beautiful outside often, the sun is shining, the leaves are growing, and there's nothing to eat because you've eaten everything from the winter stores, and if you're lucky, you could find a few nettles or hence the wild foods, which is why I was wondering.
The wild foods, if you're way far up in the north, the cattle haven't given birth yet, you don't have milk yet. And so you're basically kind of down to whatever you still have left from the winter plus nettle soup.
So you really want the gods to make things grow.
Yeah, you're looking right at it, because if things fail, if the crops you started planting in possibly as early as February, depending on the weather and just where in the north you are, if that doesn't work out, you're looking and feeling in your stomach what it's going to be like to be really in trouble for a whole year.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a crucial period.
So we don't know if his sacrifice is connected to this, but it could be.
Yeah, there's very good odds. Now P.V. Glove floated at length the theory Tolland Man was strangled and the rope was left around his neck. Another woman, a woman was deposited in the same bog with only a 12-year gap between them, as best we can tell, who had also been strangled. So that seems to have been a fairly regular practice in that area. Mm-hmm. At that time. But I was talking about bog bodies and how perfectly preserved they are. This isn't preserved like, freeze-dried or something looking alive. They go this very dark, almost tarry brownish black color all over. Their hair generally bleaches out to a sort of reddish shade. But if you saw someone like that color, if you were, say, a Viking or Migration Age Scandinavian, you would not unnaturally be very worried about where they'd come from and what they were doing. You would think, you'd probably think they were a troll of some sort, as might be expected.
This would be somebody stumbling on it later.
Yeah. This is if you're digging down into the bog, and you see someone that looks just like you, except they've gone this color.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen bog bodies, and they're extremely impressive. I mean, many of them look like a person just laid down.
Yeah, and there would also be little clues that something was amiss, such as, say, them being pinned down by hurdles or oak stakes driven through them, or what have you. That's generally a hint that you've found a body that you probably ought to leave alone.
So this is how you tell the difference one of the ways between someone, because people did, I think, just stumble into bogs sometimes.
Yeah. That is the third way to get a bog body. I was sticking to why you would put someone in the bog.
Right, okay. I didn't mean to get ahead of you. Just go on, please.
So anyway, we have these very, very well preserved but different looking bodies. And they also tend to be sort of flattened by the weight of the peat, not to greater or lesser degrees. But they still, some of them, like Tolland Man or Grauballe Man, are so well preserved that if you had known the person in life and presumably lived another 2,000 years, you would be able to recognize them with no trouble.
I know that with the DNA, they can even still find things, even on finds that were fairly a little while back in the 20th century. They released, I believe it was last week, that I can't remember her name, the girl with the string skirts. Is she a body?
She's one of the mound people. Now, she was very well preserved because she was in an oak coffin in a peaty area.
Ah, okay. So it's still peat that we're dealing with.
It's still peat that we're dealing with. In the Bronze Age, it was the fashion among the upper classes of society to put the dead in these beautiful oak coffins and then raise a nice mound over them. You know, but we're still in Denmark, southern Scandinavia, and there's still peat, and the mound bodies didn't necessarily have the water infiltration, but they had the oak, so they're still being tanned.
They're still being tanned in the same way. But what they just discovered or released is that it appears that she was raised in Bavaria before going to Denmark, where she died in Denmark as a young woman. So it's interesting. I thought they could still find more things out as the technology improved, that the bodies were that well preserved. It wasn't just bones they were going on.
Yeah, well, one of the interesting things that's come out, in fact, is that we've been mistaken about genders in several cases. The head found in Round Finn, just the head, carefully wrapped up in sheepskin and set into the bog. For years, we called her Round Fin Woman, and if you go back and read the Bog People, I believe she's called that in there, except that she wasn't actually a she. A closer look indicated that this was actually a young man whose head had been removed, very carefully wrapped in sheepskin, and put in the bog. You know, now one has to wonder there, again, what was going on? Was this meant to be an offering, or was this meant to be a head that could, in times of need, be brought out of the resting place in the bog and asked questions of? Are we looking at something like Odin with Mimir's head here?
And we have to interrupt for just a moment, because we have, I believe, a visitor who wishes to attend, someone who is singing the song of her people, which is meow. And it's very popular at this time of year. So we're going to let in this little spirit of not quite darkness, but at least Siameseness.
Originally named Brownie, but behavior indicated a rename to Boggart.
In any case, the wee folk have now entered the room. Yes, the wee folk have now entered the room, and we can continue, provided she gets very quiet.
Now, what might initially seem surprising is that despite the ample opportunity, we don't seem to have a lot of stories about the dead walking out of the bog to cause trouble. I suspect the reason for that is if somebody was dubious enough for you to put them in the bog in the first place, you made jolly sure they stayed there. Probably the majority, or at least a very hefty minority of the bodies that have been found, great efforts were made to keep them there. One of the most classic examples of it is the bog body who used to be known as Queen Gunhild, and was recently immortalized in literature by Seamus Heaney, who wrote a lovely poem about her, actually. Unfortunately, for Seamus Heaney and every other romantic person out there, the body is too old by 400 or 500 years to be Gunhild. But it was thought to be Gunhild because the bog was traditionally called Gunhild's Bog, and it's recorded in the sagas that Gunhild, who was, of course, an infamous practitioner of Seidr, and had all sorts of run-ins with interesting figures such as Skotcha Grimson, with whom she maintained kind of a long-standing, not quite a magician's duel, but they certainly did run around whittling on each other's ankles every time they got the chance, magically speaking. And Gunhild was, guess what? Drowned and left in a bog.
So finding a body?
Finding a body in roughly the right, female body in roughly the right place, who had clearly been very, very strongly intended to stay there, caused everyone to think, oh yeah, maybe this is Queen Gunhild. And then we got better technology and went back and checked, and no, this skull actually was put there somewhere in the late 5th, early 6th century.
Which doesn't mean that Queen Gunhild wasn't put there later, but that wasn't her.
If she was, we haven't found her yet.
Yes.
But that does suggest that this particular custom with regards to dicey magical people was very old.
What kind of things did they do to make sure people stayed there?
There were the most popular techniques seem to have included the oaken stake, popular in everyone's repertoire for dealing with all sorts of troublesome physical undead. Literally making hurdles, bending pieces of wood and hammering them in like giant staples. Those seem to have been the two top things. Occasionally you'll find sticks of particular woods driven in or left on top of the body for no apparent practical reason. There's one of them where these sticks in question were hazel, which is of course very strongly associated with maintaining boundaries, is possibly one of our oldest holy trees along with the birch. Birch and oak were the other two that we find over and over again.
So there actually, or apparent probably magical reasons in it, to keep the person down, not just they're just trying to tie the body down,
right?
So it doesn't float.
Yeah, they are trying. They are also very probably trying to employ magical means. You know, if you just wanted to pin the body down so it doesn't float, it would be a lot easier to just grab a chunk of pine, you know, something more quickly available. Birch, okay, you get a bog, you're probably the first trees you're going to see by it are birch trees. Since birch bark has been such a popular material for shrouds, pretty much as long as we've been in the north, I think that the choice was extremely deliberate.
So the Northern European seems to be different, and they're special too. So I think some of the oldest bog bodies ever found are actually of all places in Florida, but this looks like a group of people that's just how they buried their dead. And they seem to have just sort of tied them down so they didn't float. But it was like you find whole groups of people rather than, whereas I think the ones in Europe, aren't they just usually an individual?
Yeah, when you find a lot of people, it's almost inevitably it's almost inevitably the aftermath of a large battle.
Oh, that one they just found, where they found all of the men and their swords, and they think it was one of the largest things ever found.
Yeah, you know, classically, by all our accounts, when you win a battle, you know, you can't let the men go home. They'll be back to where you're studying next winter. You can't enslave them because you're not Rome or Egypt. You don't have the size and social mechanisms to actually keep them from just standing up one night and cutting your throat in your sleep. If you keep them as a slave, you know, what are you going to do? Well, you're going to traditionally offer them to Odin, the whole lot of them. Now, whether any of these post-battle finds where the equipment and or men were thrown into the bog, they have been assumed to be offerings to Odin, which were made in this fashion. And remember that our gods aren't exactly one god, one offering method only. But, you know, one could also question, you know, were they offerings to Nerthus, to the Vanic powers, to this goddess who seems to be characterized by the bog? You know, we can't know that.
And I actually haven't seen, I don't think any, I've only seen a few articles on that one because I think it's fairly recent, the big one, and I don't think they've even gotten to speculating as to who this may be too, just that it's a lot of dead people who've obviously been sacrificed and some soldiers, or warriors who've been thrown in with some of them with their weapons, and they mentioned that was unusual because the weapons they're worth so much money.
Yeah, but not unique. We have a great amount of equipment from Europe. I believe it's Shirt Spring where the whole freaking warboat was given to the lake.
Oh, so sometimes it's not just people they give into the box.
No, some of the weapons were actually deliberately spoiled, deliberately destroyed as a means of sending them to the other world. And that's quite common in Scandinavian graves. Sometimes they're put in completely intact. Sometimes they're deliberately broken, presumably as a means of sending them with their owner. There doesn't seem to have been a strict dogma on it, but then, strict dogma was not exactly a thing at the time.
Well, and also we're dealing with quite a long period of time, too.
Yeah.
The bog bodies, what is the oldest one found in?
In Scandinavia, there's a lone one from about 8,000. We can't really tell if she was there by accident or what. I believe it's a she. We start really getting them. The big peak is that, as I said, that Roman, late Celtic, Roman, Iron Age, and Migration Age period. But we have I believe a few actually dating back to the Bronze Age.
Yeah, as a textile person, I am more familiar with bog bodies because a lot of times particularly the peat in bogs and sometimes the opposite in lake beds will preserve fabric. So a lot of these bodies, particularly in the bog bodies, actually, because a lot of their clothing was wool and animal fiber, it has survived, sometimes in amazing detail. So as a weaver, I can go and look at it, and I can not only see the pattern, but I can see the weaving pattern and how exactly it was made. And with modern technology, you can now go and they can actually reproduce the dyes. So things that now look brown and at most maybe there's this hint of really dull green or something, you can find out they were red and purple and blue. It's just that the peat colors things, just like it makes the bodies brown, it kind of browns all of the clothing. But we know in some ways more about some of the clothing from northern Scandinavia, at least worn by a few people who got thrown in bogs, both men and women, than we do about what even a warrior was wearing, because unless they were laid in a mound grave and it happened to survive, not nearly as much, very little has survived compared to what you find in a bog. And every time they find a bog body, every person that's interested in textile archaeology that I know, that's the first thing we're looking for. We're racing to see what were they wearing and how was it cut, and you can make complete reproductions of the clothing, which is just really rare in archaeology.
Yeah, the Boxten man is one of our best sources for medieval Swedish clothing. There's a German bog body, Bernhardsfeld man from Lower Saxony, about 680 to 775 CE, somewhere in there. And he had a tunic patched out of 45 different pieces of cloth, 20 different fabrics in 9 different weaving patterns. So you can see what an absolute bonanza this would be for anyone doing historical textile art.
There are entire yearbooks on this one find, let me tell you, for weavers. But they think, though, that this was because, cloth was so expensive that people would just patch and patch and patch, particularly if you were poor, until the clothing is almost more a patch than the original garment. And we know that because we found one. You have been listening to part 1 of Cat's Eye on the Future. We'll return to the show right after these short messages. Do you have questions? The cards have answers. If you would like a personal reading with Melody, just go to my website, melodipsychicreadings.com. That's Melody with an I, psychicreadings.com, for information, or email me at melodyreader@gmail.com. Readings are available using Skype, phone, email, or even in person if you are lucky to live in Ireland. Why not find out what special messages the cards have just for you and book a private reading today? We now return to part 2 of Cat's Eye on the Future.
Yeah, well, aside from the two reasons that people are deliberately put in the bog, excluding just simple body disposal, and excluding accidentals, people who wander into the bog and never come out, we have to think about what this means in terms of the other world and the potential of interaction with the living. Now, we mentioned the mound people, who were the upper classes in the Bronze Age, given great respect at huge effort. Believe me, oak is not that easy of a wood to work with hand tools. And the bog bodies, who were put in often very elaborately in terms of efforts made to keep them there, but seem to have been one way or the other outside society. And again, we have those two classes. We have the sacrifices, who are gifts to the gods, who are given their remains, their spirits, whatever, all belong with the gods. They're that bit outside of the general community, which to us includes both the dead and the living. When you build a mound for someone, you're essentially building them a nice house. It is their house in the other world, and in the best possible circumstances, that person will stay or occasionally come back for vacations, as Helgi did. But you really, assuming that your recently deceased ancestor or whatever was a nice person, a powerful person, brought good luck to the land and such, you want them to stick around and keep looking after you. Sometimes you might make a mound in hopes that they will stay in the mound. And there's a couple of interesting things in Norse burial customs. We have mention of hell shoes, which are designed not to make that long trek down to Hell's realm easy, but to make sure the body stays where it is. The Oseberg ship was moored to a huge stone, and there's reference to the same practice in the Icelandic sagas. And the unspoken idea seems to be that we'd just as soon this ship didn't come sailing back from the land of the dead. Thank you.
Is this like tying shoelaces of the dead person together?
Yeah, and one interesting side note is that habit of tying the ID tags to the big toes of the dead in the morgue. Mm-hmm. That started in New York City, and the reason it started is that most of the morgue keepers at the time, or a good proportion of them, were Irish, and tying the toes of the deceased together while they were laying out in that border period between death and burial was an old Irish custom. Now, whether it was a Celtic custom originally or whether the Irish actually got it from the Scandinavians, either is possible given the similarities. No one can say, but anyway, that's why they tie ID tags to the big toes in the morgue, basically to keep them where they are until the autopsy has been performed, if it's going to be performed, and the body has been duly interred.
And that must be what morphed into the idea, because the way I learned it was you tie the shoelaces together.
Yeah, that's actually, I believe that was one of the possible elements of hell shoes.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Yeah, so, but if you build someone a mound, they're still part of the community. That mound becomes a place where you can make offerings. It becomes a place that you can go and sit on to get the advice of the dead. In fact, there was actually a proverb, sitting on a burial mound, sitting on a howe, like a king. Because kings were expected to do that kind of thing. They were expected to sit on the mounds of their predecessors in order to get advice to communicate with the other world. We have a runic inscription commemorating a guy who is described as the Thule, the inspired speaker, on the mounds at Saul. And sitting on the mounds again seems to have been a significant element of that communication with the other world. With the possible exception of the round fin man, that doesn't seem to be the case with bog bodies. Either they're given to the gods, or they are someone who is in some way crucially outside society, like the Scythe worker, the magically suspect person. Tacitus claimed adulteresses and the cowardly, effeminate, whatever men were drowned, but given the number of male to female corpses, and given the number that we thought originally were female, possibly influenced by Tacitus, and turned out to be male, well, let me put it this way. The last time anyone actually believed that Germanic women were particularly chaste was 1945. Certainly it wasn't the case according to any of the contemporaries. And given the noted sexual freedom of Germanic women, at least in the Viking Age, as recorded in the sagas, the laws, and by the occasional Arab historian visiting, I think we can probably safely say that Tacitus was having it on in order to make a moral statement to the Romans.
Well, didn't the Romans, wasn't sort of a case of the chaste and noble barbarian as opposed to you?
Yeah, Tacitus was very much making a noble savage statement, and it's more, since we're not even sure he actually made it to Germania himself, there's some question on that. It's highly speculative that speculatable that what he didn't know he kind of made up to make his point. So everyone loves him, but he's not the most reliable possible source.
Well, it also strikes me as the kind of thing that, if you were just interviewing freedmen or, Germanic freedmen or the Emperor's guards or whatever, they might tell you, oh yes, all of our women are perfectly always behaved, and we kill them if they are not. Right.
But we
after they hit us over the head with a frying pan.
So we don't really know about that, but the bodies found tend to suggest that Tacitus was pulling it out of his hat.
Well, especially finding out so many were male, I wasn't even aware of that. So
some of them were real surprises to us there.
Now, some of the mounds, aren't they actually on the inside when they were made? I mean, some of the ones that are very far north where it's very cold, didn't they have like wood paneling and, actually look like a house on the inside?
They did. It was, as I said, huge effort with the mounds from the Bronze Age through the end of the Viking Age was made to make the dead person comfortable. And again, that's part of that continuance of the community thing. In fact, it's strongly suspected that our house ghosts, our Tomto or Nissa or Kobold or whatever you want to call him, is actually the first settler who, landed on the land, died, was buried in his mound, which was already a pretty popular practice in the Stone Age, and stuck around to watch over the family, watch over the land. Whereas with the bog people, that's completely not the case, quite the antithesis.
So, if the people in the mounds are, generally friendly, why this emphasis on not wanting the dead to walk? I think you have some stories on this.
Yeah, there's generally friendly, and then there's a lot of people that were buried in mounds did, in fact, get up and cause trouble. Thorolfr Twistfoot from Erbigja being a prize case in point, because, and of course, a number of our Groigar stories, like I believe it's Kaur the Old in Greta's saga, those in mounds do one way or another cause trouble. Now, Kaur the Old actually fulfilled both roles because he seems to have dedicated his posthumous activities to scaring and bothering the snot out of the neighbors so that they would go away and his son could take their land. So he was looking out for his living kin, but he was also perpetrating this reign of terror here.
So what is a Draugr?
A Draugr is a particular type of Scandinavian undead. They're similar to zombies in the fact that they're still in the body, and the body can look manky. For instance, it usually goes all black, kind of like a bog body, say. It also can swell up to the size of an ox, which bog bodies don't do, but dead bodies in general in the wrong conditions can swell pretty impressively, and also go dark with livor mortis and eventually with decay. And Draugr seem to have a lot more intelligence going for them, not to mention magical powers, than your average, brains type zombie.
They're not like mindless zombies.
No, they tend to know what they're doing, even if what they're doing is just messing with the living. And
so is that mostly what they do?
Yeah, they come out and they'll kill cattle, they'll kill sheep, they'll kill the herders. They spread fatal diseases, usually being killed by a Draugr, or the disease it's sharing results in the victim also becoming a Draugr.
So they are zombies.
They're zombies in the sense of they are physical walking dead bodies and contagious. Yeah, let's not forget the contagious bit. Not that nice simple, it bites you, you get the zombie virus or whatever, but more a sort of spiritual contagion. And that goes along with this understanding that those who have been particularly close to the other world, especially if it's one of the more questionable forms of magic, are that much likelier to become Draugr, although sometimes it just happens because the person was bloody stroppy in life. And again, I'm thinking of Thorolfr Twistfoot, not any kind of magician, but he was a right old bugger. And he was a very unpleasant person in life. They came into the hall when he died and found him sitting in stone cold in his high seat, glaring so dreadfully that no one except his son was able to go up to him and start dealing with the problem. Now, interestingly, once they got old Thorolfr planted, as long as his son was alive, he stayed where he was and didn't bother anyone. But the moment his son died, then he started coming out and wreaking havoc. And then they had to drag his body out on a sledge and burn it. And from the ashes followed that whole episode with the cow licking the ashes, showing up with a gray calf. And remember again, in Iceland, if an animal is gray, it's supernatural. And the calf grows up and has an ill doom about it, and eventually kills the owner and runs off into the bog and is never seen again.
So there is kind of a connection still between even weird acting dead people in bogs.
Yeah. Again, we're out there in that borderland, in that area, which is the land of exile from the community. I can't call it the equivalent of the Christian burying someone outside the churchyard in unhallowed ground overall, because there is the other side of that to us, the closeness to the other world, making it the ideal place for holy activities, for holy sacrifices. But in the case of how magical people are handled, if they had a bad reputation in life, it's not a bad analogy.
Well, aren't objects also buried in bogs?
Yes, and that's more by way. Some are offerings, some are hoards. The difference is a hoard is what you put there because the enemy army's bearing down on you and you're planning to come back later. An offering is what you put there for the gods with the intention that it should stay there. And occasionally we find rune staves and so forth put in bogs probably as a part of the magic, probably because they're in there, they're hiding in this place that is full of might, and because of that, they're able to exert might more effectively through the other world to get the intended effect.
Well, I think people understood also the preserving virtues of the bog, because we constantly in Ireland, well, not constantly, but they frequently find, butter in crocks that it could be 200 years old, it can be 2,000 years old. Until they send it to Dublin to be analyzed, they don't know, because for as long as people have been making butter.
Yeah, they've been putting it in bogs. Yeah. I think our ancestors were certainly well aware of that.
Yeah, and I'm sure they would have found animals, and as well as, the occasional accidentally ancient body.
Yes, there have been a number of animals found, and of course, unless there's stuff with the animals, we can't always tell whether they were put there deliberately or not. Though if you find, for instance, a horse where the head has been busted in with a hammer and there's no sign of butchering, it's pretty good odds it was an offering.
Oh, yeah.
But in terms of putting offerings in bogs, we've been doing that since we got to Scandinavia. In fact, there's some wonderful amber necklaces in the National Museum in Copenhagen, which are huge. I am talking chunks of raw amber the size of my fist, and in a strand which is more than twice my own height. It's too big for a human to have worn. It was obviously meant to be a gift to a deity. And one of the interesting things, I mentioned P.V. Glubb and his theory about the necklace goddess and the offerings by hanging. And it is, in terms of imagery at least, it is just possible that this is one of the things that might be trackable from the Stone Age through the Viking Age. In the Bronze Age, we find a large number of little bronze female statuettes, all of which have a necklace or torque-like item, either incised on them, sculpted on them, what have you. And that moves eventually along, we think, to Freya's Brisingamen. And P.V. Glubb's opinion was that the twisted hanging noose was literally meant to represent the goddess's twisted torque.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Now, do we buy it or do we not? I don't know, but it seems moderately plausible.
Yeah,
We'll never be able to prove it.
When I saw those strings of amber, I thought that maybe they'd been meant to go on a statue.
Yeah, which may have been the case.
Because they're certainly not. No person could wear this even ritually. I mean, they're just way, way too big and too heavy.
Yeah.
There's some things a person might be able to tolerate for a small amount of time. Human beings do that to themselves when they're dressing up. But this stuff was obviously either thrown in as it was, or originally hanging on something.
Right, and unless we don't have a lot of early statues, because we tended to do everything in wood. We've always been a wood culture. So unless like the oak carving from Denmark I mentioned earlier, or an earlier one, which is, well, we all call him Freyr, because this started out as a piece of wood with a remarkably suggestive initial figure that someone carved a face on the top end, and I believe a little bit of detailing elsewhere, so that you were really, really sure that this was a male god and probably a fruitfulness god. And he too was found in a bog, perfectly preserved. So it's quite plausible that those Stone Age strings of amber were meant for a wooden statue, but until and unless one turns up in a bog, we'll never know.
Well, I think this is really, really interesting. I think before we go, though, I think you had a story you wanted to tell us.
Yes, and this isn't exactly a bog body story, but it is a story about the Walking Dead, which is not entirely inappropriate. One thing I did not mention about Groigar, we talked about their spontaneous manifestations, but but it was also perfectly possible, and if you read Icelandic folk tales from a bit later on, you'd think it was almost common. Droigar could also be raised by a magician of sufficient skill. There's a very detailed and rather disgusting account of exactly how you do that. And it involves, well, first you call the Droigar out of his grave, and then you check to see how old he is, because that's going to make a difference based on his power level. They seem to go through a certain period, I think something like 150 years of increase in power, and then it starts dropping down again. You also might want to have checked out the physique and fighter training of the Droigar, because the first thing you've got to do is wrestle him. And assuming that you win the wrestling match, and you don't want to think about what would happen if you don't, once you've got to get him down, you have to suck this stuff called corpse froth out of his mouth. This is something that happens in the natural course of decay, or used to happen. Maybe we do not see so many Droigar now because bodies tend to get the formaldehyde in them first thing, and therefore don't produce corpse froth, at least not when they're where you can get at him. Besides, it's probably not healthy to suck, well, actually it's not healthy to suck corpse froth under any circumstances, but I'm sure formaldehyde wouldn't help. And then you proceed from there. So, well, I guess in Iceland, people who were used to eating haukarl, which is that horrible fermented shark stuff, might not have been as picky about what went into their mouths as modern Westerners are. But anyway, so raising Droigar was a thing that happened, and there is a folk story of these two magicians. Can't remember their actual names, but we'll call them Jon and Sigurður. And they live on either side of a mountain range for each other, and they're deadly enemies. So one day, Jon decides, well, it's time for him to do something about his rival over there on the other side of the mountains. So he summons up not one, but 19, count them 19, Droigar, and I hope he had a good bottle of mouthwash. But anyway, and he tells them to truck over the mountain passes and kill his rival. Okay, so 19 Droigar set off, trudge. Meanwhile, Sigurður, who is nobody's fool, knows that his rival is going to be trying something, so, by one means and another, he keeps an eye out, and he sees these 19 Droigar trudging up Jon's side of the mountain range, not actually moaning brains, because Droigar don't actually do that. But they're trudging along. Okay, so he gets his stuff ready, and when they come over the mountain and head down the road towards his house, he's ready for them, and he does his stuff and stops them in their tracks. And he goes out and takes a good close look at them, and he counts them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. Okay, let's try that again. Line up, you guys. Stand. Stay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. Right. I know there were 19 of you when you started up over the mountains. Where is the other one? And the Droigar sort of shuffle and mumble a bit. And Sigurður increases the power of his commands. Tell me where number 19 is. And finally, one of the Droigar steps forward and says, well, yeah, there were 19 of us, but, it was a long way over the mountains, and we kind of got hungry.
Ta-da! Well, I think that was a nice, or at least appropriately seasonal way to end the show. I want to thank you so much for your time and for dropping by today. And I hope to see you back again soon. And I want to thank my listeners for being here. I want everyone to have, I hope you actually have had, since this will be the Monday after the holiday, but I hope everybody had a great time this Halloween, and we look forward to other stuff because this is the dark time of the year, and Yule is coming. With that note, thank you all for listening this week's Cat's Eye on the Future. See you again next time. You have been listening to Cat's Eye on the Future, the show where we take a look at what's coming up in your world and your future. Join us again next time for another episode of Cat's Eye on the Future.